Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am pleased and honored to have on the podcast Dr. Inger Burnett-Ziegler. She is a licensed clinical psychologist, associate professor, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University. She has much experience with clinical interventions and working with a clinical population, typically those that have mood and anxiety disorders, along with interpersonal relationships, as well as doing research and doing lots of empirical research in a clinical-based setting to understand the social determinants that health play in disparities for mental illness and treatment, particularly within the Black community. She is the author of the book, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, The Emotional Lives of Black Women, which is a couple of weeks old now. It's only been out for a couple of weeks. And that is what we talk about in this conversation. We start by talking about her background and reasoning for writing the book. And then we just jump right in and we talk about, I would say, the central thesis of the book, which is this fact that, as she claims that, in the book and says throughout, Black women have, or in the abstract, in general, have this notion of wanting to, or having to appear strong and put on a facade, if you will. And she is fine with that in one sense, but also wants to have the total picture of how, Black women can also share their feelings and be vulnerable, and also that can show strength. And so we talk about that, the origins of that norm that Black women must be strong and shouldn't be too vulnerable. We talk about the current internal and external barriers for Black women being able to express their positive and negative emotions and just experiences overall. We talk about the role of empowerment and authentic expressions of the self and how that is received by Black women that she knows, clinically and personally, and just how that's, the needle is moving on that, but how it's been a challenge to do that. We talk about the role of intergenerational trauma and a little bit of, what that is and how it's related to complex trauma. We talked about the aspect of colorism for Black women. And then we end the conversation by talking about the stigma that is there for folks in the Black community, but then also for Black women in seeking mental health treatment and why that is deterred in many circles. This was such an important conversation, and it was a really fun conversation. Inger's a wonderful person. She's super brilliant. Her book is fantastic. And I really support her work and what she's doing. And so I was just super pleased that I could talk to her about something that I don't think gets talked about enough in such a balanced and, forward-looking way. And so she's just wonderful on all accounts. And so now I bring you Inger Burnett-Ziegler. I'm here with Inger Burnett-Ziegler. How's it going?
Very well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you for coming on. I was just sharing that I absolutely loved your book, and the cover's great, the content's great, and so I want to get into all the details. So for listeners, the book is Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, The Emotional Lives of Black Women, and it's fantastic. So before we get into it, just tell folks who you are, what you do, and why you wanted to write the book.
Sure. So as you introduced me, I am Inger Burnett-Ziegler. I am a clinical psychologist and associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Northwestern. As a part of that work, I have a clinical practice where I see primarily adults with mood and anxiety disorders, so things like depression, anxiety, stress, trauma, relationship challenges. But the majority of my work is focused on research on mental health in the African American community, with a specific focus on really understanding the factors that contribute to people having greater mental health need, and also those barriers that get in the way of folks being able to get the help that they need. And so as I talk about in the book, recognizing that history of trauma, disproportionate burden of stress, inadequate resources, living in communities of violence, et cetera, are all factors that contribute to the higher risk of African Americans having poor mental health outcomes, and that lack of resources also being a significant barrier to people getting the help that they need. So those are the things that I address as a part of my clinical and research practice, and wanted to really open the door for that conversation through the book with a specific focus on Black women.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I've had a few people on that have done something similar where they do clinical practice and then research. And so it always makes me happy to know that people in my field are doing research and clinical work, and it's not all just, teach and research. That's important too. No shame in that, but it's not only academic. There's a nice healthy mix there. And so I think that's super important and very instructive for a lot of folks. So that's great to hear.
Yeah, thank you. And my research is clinically focused. So, going out into communities, examining a mindfulness intervention specifically for Black women with depression, and seeing how we can provide these types of interventions in community-based settings and increase the access to mental health interventions more broadly. Yeah,
no, that's great. So the book is wonderful. And I like how you organize it. It's very digestible, and I think kind of general population can pick it up and get it pretty well, and even folks that are in clinical psych or other mental health fields, they can also get a lot out of it. So it's nice how it reaches a lot of different folks. So let's just start with the main theme, at least in my reading of it when I was reading it, was in society today, we hear a lot about the problems of many communities, right? So obviously with the Black community, with Hispanics, et cetera. And you address that, you talk about that. But one of the things that you do super well and in a very, I think, kind, at least that's how it reads, in an authentic way, is you also talk about solutions, and you also talk about some ways in which Black women specifically can have empowerment, true empowerment, and what that looks like. And so you spend some time in the beginning discussing, that there's this sort of mask that Black women have to, or feel they have to wear, to always present as being strong, and that they can't always express their emotions or feel that they can express some vulnerabilities. And so, where do you feel this norm of Black women having to be strong and can't be too vulnerable or share their suffering, where do you think that comes from? And just kind of, walk us through some of that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that the origin of this strong Black woman prototype, as I mentioned in those early chapters in the book, is likely rooted in, history of slavery, whereby Black people and Black women really were forced to be strong as a means of survival, and that expressing any sort of weakness or vulnerability could really have life-threatening implications. I think that with that, there's been this legacy that's kind of been passed down through the generations, whereby, Black women today, and I relate to this myself, where it's just kind of become this inherent way of being by putting forth this steadfastness, this toughness, this sense of being able to overcome and deal with whatever life's challenges are the ways that we're really kind of raised to be, even as little girls. I think back on some of the just passing messages that I received as a little girl about how to cope with difficult emotions, like shake it off, or you'll be all right, or it's not that bad, or what are you crying about? And I know a lot of Black girls and Black women share that experience. And I think that that's the way we're kind of passively taught to be strong, to be able to deal with tough experiences. But in addition to that, that's modeled all around us. We see, women in our families, women in our neighborhoods and in the workplace, putting forth this, mask or facade, if you will, of strength. And we don't see that ready expression of vulnerability or distress, or whatever it may be, present below the surface. And so, I think that it's really deeply embedded in our core as the way we're supposed to be. And that leaves a lot of people kind of unsure of what to do and how to deal when these difficult feelings come to the surface. And there hasn't been a model or a guide book of how to deal with that.
So I think this is very powerful the way you're kind of laying it out, because how I'm understanding it is that through the history in the United States of Black folk, and particularly Black women, as you list in the book, is there's obviously the grotesque history of slavery. And so, okay, well, how does one get through that period? And we're talking hundreds of years of this. This wasn't 20 years or something, right? Hundreds of years. And so you don't want to appear and don't want to be, I guess, in some ways, weak, right? Because that's a vulnerability you don't want, right? That could literally mean death. That could really be serious. And so you have generations of Black folk saying, you have to present this way, Black women specifically, this is how you have to be, so you're not kind of the weak link here. And so you want to make sure that that's there so you can survive. And so in current day, right, I think some people might say, well, yeah, but that was we see the ripple effects, but that's not the case anymore. Right. I think the challenge with some of that is, well, you don't have 400 years or plus or minus, and then it just goes away. If that's all these things kind of passed down kind of in this sort of the canon of the history, or then what's modeled within Black communities, and it's still a certain model, and so that's what's going to be there, and that would make sense in terms of how things continue. And I think that your message in the book is, yes, how can you be strong, but how can you be strong through expressing how you feel about various experiences? How are you able to show, yes, strength and one way of providing and taking care of folks in the community, but also showing that you can, have a hard day, or, you don't get everything right, or, things might, wear you down, and that's also okay. And there's this kind of, how do we fashion a new model, or at least
right.
What you're saying for Black women. And so what would you say are so that's important, not just for context, but how it continues to always kind of be the background. But what are some other things, I guess, that are blocking, or what are some barriers for Black women in particular that are, I guess, not giving them the space to really show their authentic selves? Is that an internal thing or an external thing, or both? Or
there are a couple of things that you brought up that I'd like to respond to. Mm-hmm. And you I think justly point out this idea that some people might push back that, yes, this was a way of being that was rooted in a history of slavery, but these are no longer the conditions. And I agree with that. And I think it's important to point out that even though those specific conditions are no longer present, the behavior and the modeling of that behavior has really persisted, whereby many Black women have not kind of changed their way of being, even though those circumstances are different. Further, there continues to be a multitude of real challenges that strength is used to confront, to cope with, racism and discrimination in the workplace, intergenerational family trauma, domestic violence, community violence, all of these circumstances by which people still feel deeply that this presentation of strength is the only way that they can safely survive and show up in the world. And so for many, there's still this necessity that I have to have my game face on at work at all times, or if not, I might be judged to not be able to do the job or not be a hard worker, or might not be cut out for this environment. If I don't have my game face, my strength mask on when I'm walking down the street, then I might be susceptible to being, assaulted or physically harmed, or, if I present myself as soft or weak in my family, they may think that, I can't take care of my kids or I can't be there for them. And so that's a part of kind of this, some of the rationale why people still feel the necessity to continue to engage with this way of being. To extend to kind of the latter part of what you were saying, because of that, because of the history and the present day rationale, I think folks are not really oriented to attending to this question of how do I feel, right? How is all of these experiences, trauma, stress, racism, how is that showing up emotionally? How is that showing up in how I see myself, how I see others? How is that showing up behaviorally? As a clinician, we were talking earlier about, the integration of clinical and research. As a clinician, I'm always still really struck by the lack of attention people give to that internal experience. Because they're so focused on one step in front of the other, just kind of pushing through and making it. And so I think that's part of it. Like we haven't given Black women the space to ask ourselves, how do you feel right now in this moment? We haven't made that safe. And we haven't given people the tools to cope with that, right? Because you open that up and then people have to have the available tools to be able to understand with compassion, without judgment, what that emotional experience is like, and to be able to continue to move forward and make some positive behavioral changes.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a sort of a follow-up on that, which is, it seems like so for folks that, I guess we can just say society at large, right? So people not in the Black community, they may be willing to hear some of the feelings that Black women maybe are not sharing as readily as maybe anyone should. But sometimes there's somewhat of a disconnect of this kind of generational and cultural kind of understanding of why that's so difficult, or why that's there. And again, that's not to say that, people are kind of, anchored to their past or generations ago, and that's it. And that's all, the game's over, that's just how it's going to be. And that's how it is forever. But, I do think it's important for people to understand. And on the reverse, I would say that, I don't obviously know this personally, but I wonder, I'm curious, is it maybe within the Black community, there is not space to really share those things, amongst other Black folk because of certain perceptions, or how that might be received, or, and so it's just kind of this weird quandary of, well, where do I share this, or where people get it and understand, or I'm not being, ridiculed or ostracized or said other things. Is that about right, or am I mischaracterizing it?
No, I think that's right, and I think the fact that that's not kind of yet a norm plays a role, and so there's this sense of isolation and shame when people are experiencing the distress, the trauma, because it's not being openly talked about. I hear this in my clinical practice all the time, people feeling like they're the only ones. And that is another, reason why I thought it was important to write this book, because I had person after person coming into the therapy space feeling weighed down by shame, that they were having, a hard time coping, not realizing that there were so many other people that were having the exact same experience. And so when we hold things kind of to ourselves, people don't realize how universal some of these experiences are. And it takes one or two or a couple of people to kind of speak out. And I've been talking a lot about what I think is the importance of Black women popular figures talking about their mental health, like, Michelle Obama and Serena Williams and Naomi Osaka and others, because I think that really sets the stage to normalize these emotional experiences, normalize having conversation around it, and it gives permission for everyday folks to reflect on their own experiences and have conversation in their community. To add on to that, I think that there's great potential for the generational impact of, talking about the role of trauma, the role of family trauma, the role of family secrets. In the process of writing the book, that was definitely a powerful part of the process in terms of having these conversations with, my own mom. Because, being a younger generation and being a psychologist, of course, I think about, mental health differently. I obviously am more open to having conversations about mental health, but seeing her needle move, and I hear this, with other people, like the younger generation kind of pushing the needle for some of our elders, I think is a really powerful space as we think about kind of shifting that model in terms of what's talked about and how these things are dealt with.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that kind of goes to my point that I mentioned earlier that I wanted to ask about is, again, it's in the book, it's kind of throughout, it's definitely early on, is, again, you're many, I hear many of these conversations where it will be an emphasis on, whether there is some actual, victimization, or there is some, generational trauma, or it's all the woes, right? It's all the hard things that are so true. They're real, obviously. And I'm always, turning the page or whatever. And I'm like, okay, so where do we have the solutions, or how do we try and forge a new way? And I don't hear that so much. And that always kind of, makes me sad, but it also frustrates me, because it's like, well, these things are true, sure, but how do we make them not true in a current sense, right? They're always going to be historically true, but how do we, forge a new way? And that was the thing that just made the book, really just light up for me. It was like, whoa, like this is, you weren't, saying anything that was like, super groundbreaking in one sense, right? It was like, this is very simple. Like, this is, in one sense, it's like straightforward, like, here we go. But then it's like, yeah, that in and of itself is, maybe cognitively it's easy to kind of get, but, getting the whole person on board with how are you able to express all aspects of yourself and try to find your authentic self and find, ways of sharing all of your experiences can be really, really challenging. And so what are the ways in which as you've talked about this clinically, or maybe even personally, or in social settings, what is the, do you have any resistance to this, or do people say like, no, or that can't be, or maybe, yeah, sure, of course, we should all, kind of be balanced individuals, but come on, that's not going to happen. We can't ignore all these horrible things in the world, or how is it welcomed by other Black women you talk to, clinically, personally, or whatever. Kind of just what's this approach of, how can you, keep the strong, Black woman archetype, if you will, but also incorporating many holistic, positive aspects such as compassion, care, resilience, determination, etc.
Yeah, I think that the main barrier is intense fear. Fear of what it means to be vulnerable, not only for each individual, but for how that will be received in the world. From an individual perspective, if I attend to these painful things that I've gone through in my life, will I be able to get up and keep going on a daily basis? It's something that I hear come up a lot. If I share these intimate parts of myself with others, be it family, a professional, someplace in work, will they still love me? Will they judge me? Will they abandon me? And I think all of these fears are disabling. I think, conceptually, I hear a lot of people say, oh yes, like this seems like a good idea. But in practice, I think that there's still a good bit of fear. And one way I try and work with people on that is, okay, well, let's identify some of the safe spaces that we might be able to just experiment with this concept. And that might be something as I'm having a hard time right now, right? For whatever reason that might be. Maybe it's a new mom, maybe it's stressful at work, maybe it's a harmful relationship. Sometimes people kind of want to take on the whole thing, the whole history of trauma. So what might be like the incremental step that one can express, be vulnerable to a small degree, ask for what the support that they need from the other, and allow themselves to be able to receive that. What you were saying kind of reminded me of, what I was hoping one of the takeaways of the book would be is the harm of this continued pattern of silence and secrecy. And again, I think it's harmful on many levels. I think it gives room for harmful patterns of behaviors to persist, harmful patterns within families to persist. As stuff happens in families, is swept under the rug. Nobody really understands, and thus is never dealt with, and then it repeats in future generations. When people don't identify their own trauma, they don't recognize how it's showing up. The behaviors happen. They don't identify these as trauma rooted behaviors. And so that continues, and children are impacted by that. And so this kind of, raising the veil, I think, is a part of lifting up this shame and secrecy and that awareness. As you know from the book, I'm a big believer in the value of mindfulness. That awareness really gives people the opportunity to make a different conscious choice. When we're not aware, we're stuck in unhealthy patterns of behavior, but that awareness gives us the power to choose something different.
Yeah, well, two things jump out at me about that is, one is fears. And I think that there's fears. I think there's legitimacy to that. Yeah.
Yes.
Where people have, I think that's legitimate. And it can be a big ask for people when they've had previous negative experiences. It's like, well, I don't want to do that again. But I also hear, it comes to the book and it seems like there's this like, unsaid or maybe unconscious pressure. It's what it feels like. At least that's how it comes out. Is there's this pressure to keep it together, and expressing the vulnerable parts of yourself is the fear of what gets out, secrets, things like that. But then also this pressure of, well, then I might not seem as keeping it together. And, sometimes society isn't very helpful. Sometimes my own family isn't helpful. My friends don't get it. So I got to keep it together either for my kids or I got, other family members. And so and when you think about all of that, again, I don't think maybe, but I don't think Black women go around every day thinking about fear and pressure, but that's in the background though. And so, how you talk about in the book, this way of trying to, through therapy, obviously, but, this problem focused strategy, right? Self-regulating emotions, assertive communication, boundary setting. How has that been received when you've tried to implement this, or when you've chatted about it kind of more casually or socially? How is that usually received?
Yeah, I think it's received as a light bulb. You just said something about fear and pressure being in the background, and I would argue that it's inching toward the front, particularly over the last year, where, in the context of, civil unrest and COVID, that fear has really been palpable for a lot of people, including but not limited to Black women, and particularly those that already have a trauma history. And that fear has real emotional and behavioral consequences that are not always readily identified by the individual. So that problem-focused approach is really recognizing the presence and the role of that fear, recognizing how it shows up in the body, shows up in the mind, shows up in behavior, being able to, approach rather than avoid those fearful situations. As a clinician, I'm sure you can appreciate, folks that are just, struggle with saying, yes, I am afraid.
Yes, it's very hard.
It is hard, right? So to even, work with someone on cultivating that awareness. Similarly, from the pressure perspective, that's something that I would argue is really at the forefront of a broad spectrum of Black women, that pressure that comes from real direct family messages of how you should show up in the world, what your responsibility to your family is, what your responsibility to your community is, not having any room to make mistakes, particularly in white spaces. This belief of having to be, of course, 10 times better in order to get to the same space, that's deeply internalized. And it's internalized in a way that is can lead to a lot of self-doubt, can lead to a lot of self-monitoring. And again, awareness of that, raising that to one's attention and saying, where are these messages coming from? What part of that do you accept as your role? And what part of that do you maybe want to release yourself from? And I find that the invitation to for people to release themselves from some of those expectations can be really liberating for a lot of women.
Yeah, well, about the emotional component of it, right. As clinicians, I find that many individuals have just this kind of this really poor diet, or this malnourishment, if you will, of understanding what emotions are and aren't, and how you can express them. And some of that is just, generational ignorance. My parents and grandparents, they didn't really know, right? And, it's, what do you expect, right? But it's also one of those things where it's like, okay, but we know more now. And it's, I think, the job for clinicians to precisely and accurately explain that, and I would say even more so for folks that write popular books, is to do it accurately and to make that okay, because that's a part of human experience. And I think when we don't, we see how that has really harmful and deleterious effects on folks. And I think that's trying to break that from continuing is very tough for I think everybody, but as you highlight in the book, you kind of uniquely for Black women. You've mentioned it, but before we go to the next topic, I wanted to just say about the, you've mentioned a few times about intergenerational trauma, and trauma is a loaded word. It is a word that gets thrown around by lots of different people, many times inaccurately. Just how do you, briefly, how do you understand, just in general, how we understand the basic mechanisms of like trauma and intergenerational trauma, and how that manifests itself for Black women in particular?
Yeah, I think you're spot on that trauma certainly is a word that's been getting thrown around a lot of late. And, we know that there's a whole list of things that can be categorized as traumatic experiences or life-threatening experiences, including, childhood, physical, sexual abuse and neglect, intimate partner violence, chronic illness, exposure to neighborhood violence, traumatic loss through death or separation, and others. And, when I think about intergenerational trauma and the way that often can show up, particularly in Black families, as I highlight in some of the stories in the book, there may be an individual who experienced, childhood abuse while simultaneously watching their mother be the victim of domestic violence, and as a means of leaving that household situation, themselves go into an unhealthy, romantic relationship where they similarly experience domestic violence, and their children are then witness to that, and then the cycle continues. And I use that because I think that's kind of a common example that comes up, added with the layer of, again, the silence and secrecy around those experiences that allow those behaviors to continue to exist. I think that, in addition to that, there's, race-based trauma associated with just our existence in the world. We've seen that particularly highlighted this past year with police violence and the like being shown on television repeatedly, and that activating a traumatic response in many people that are viewing that. And so, it's really kind of a multifold experience that a lot of people are kind of forced to contend with.
Yeah, I think, I can't remember if you mentioned it by name in the book, but, I think there's a lot of complex trauma as well that happens, which is sort of interconnected with the intergenerational piece. I'm not a trauma expert, but my limited knowledge of this is that, complex trauma is usually where there's basically multiple traumas that are happening either concurrently to someone or in quick succession. So, someone could have the loss of a grandparent, and their neighbor got shot, and they got kicked out of school. And, all of those things kind of make a bad kind of mix of all of these different things, and which would make it complex. And so you could have some of those things that start to carry through generations, where you normalize these certain patterns of behavior, and then these start to happen in generations down the line. So I'm aware that that's also in the mix as well, which is making it very complicated.
Yeah, and I think this is an important piece, because a lot of people that I work with don't identify some of these experiences as being trauma experiences, and in turn don't fully appreciate the ways that they've been impacted by these experiences, that fear that we just talked about, that being on edge, that looking over the shoulder, that sense of mistrust is disconnected from those previous experiences of trauma. And in working with people and kind of connecting those dots for them, that can often bring some relief, like, oh, this is this is why I feel this way. And that's empowering to people, rather than this sense of, I'm just this way and I don't know why, and a feeling of helplessness that can come along with that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, again, we're giving a free promotion here for why therapy works. And,
That's right.
but
right.
there's this there's this very big piece that is powerful of having insight accurately into your own subjective experiences. And it's like, oh, like I've felt this way, or I've thought about these things, but I never knew what it was or how to classify or where to put it. And now I do. And it's kind of like, getting all the puzzle pieces out of the box and flipping them over. And you're like, oh, okay, I can at least see where all this is. And I can start to find ways of putting it together and then saying, oh, okay, this makes more sense. And so, you need the space and, I would say, guidance many times of in therapy. I've been to my own therapy. I think you say in the book you've been to your own. That's just true for everybody. So, okay, so two big topics before I let you go. So I'll be honest with you about this one. I was a little nervous to ask this question, and because I know it's a thing that exists, but it always makes people a little uncomfortable sometimes. So I've had plenty of clients in my own practice that, when I first heard it, I was kind of, stunned of sorts. And then I've heard it many, many, many times, unfortunately. And so now I'm aware of it now. And so I've tried to help as best I can. But in relationships, not exclusive to, but I think it mostly shows up in romantic relationships, I guess you could say, dating, things like that, is this issue of, for Black women, is colorism. Basically that there's different attitudes and perceptions and ways that darker skinned Black women may be treated, as opposed to lighter skinned and Black women, and everywhere in between, that there's a sort of range of opinions or ideas or judgments, conscious or unconscious, that they will feel and experience. And so what do you want to say about this? I'm by no means an expert in this, so I'm very curious for Black women. Maybe you want to say how this plays out, or what this looks like, and how to handle that, because I hear so much emotional pain, because there's all the, dating sucks, right? It's half the time it's bullshit, right? It's just terrible. No one likes it. You're trying to figure yourself and other things out. And then you got this layer added onto it, especially if you're dating, within your race, but then outside your race. It's just a lot of messy variables here. And I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah. Yes, it's a thing, a very real thing that continues to be present for Black women, not only in the context of dating. I would argue in some workplaces, there's a heightened awareness around how color contributes to how people are received in certain spaces. When you were starting this question, a thought popped into my mind in one of my very first psychology internships on an inpatient unit. An older white woman who was paranoid schizophrenic by diagnosis, told me, yeah, you're pretty for a dark girl. And I received it with the intention, with the spirit that I thought that it was intended. Right. I was a developing mental health professional, so sure. It didn't throw me off too much, and of course, I was already familiar with the role of color and beauty specifically. And I think, sorry.
There was one more thing though to process though at the end of the day where it's like, okay, I'm trying to deal with this person's mental health challenges and I'm getting thrown this curveball as well, right. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, we could have a whole separate talk about how that comes up in workspaces.
Yes.
But, I think it brings to light this idea whereby one's goodness in one bucket and their beauty is measured according to their proximity to whiteness. Mm-hmm. And the lighter, the more beautiful, the more tolerable, the more pure, if you will, people are evaluated to be. And I certainly also hear it come up in dating in very explicit ways where there's a profound pain with the awareness that they are understood to be less beautiful because they're darker skinned. I've heard the same stories, and
I can hear all the counters to this, and I can entertain some of that, I guess. For me personally, I can listen to different points of view, but at the end of the day, to me, the human always comes first, and the person's experience comes first. And it's like, yeah, okay, maybe you have a different opinion or something, but somebody is saying that these things were said or these things happened. That's an experience. Now you can put a valuation on it, right? You can put whatever valence you want. Is it positive, negative, neutral, whatever you want to put on it, but it happens. Like it's a thing that happens. Like it's, and I don't, it's always puzzling to me where people are trying to, say certain things that, as if it's not happening or, oh, that doesn't happen that much. And we'll say, well, even if it doesn't, that's still not a good thing we should be shooting for. But it's also, I've also heard those same stories, clinically and even in my personal life as well from some of my friends. It's just, there's this, it can be like pretty explicit. Like it's not even like an implicit thing, like some kind of off the cuff kind of comment or something. It can be like pretty explicit as well. And, again, as you kind of shared with your own personal story, it's just another wrinkle. And how are ways of trying to acknowledge that, but also try and, express, that this is a shitty thing to hear, or this sucks. I don't like hearing this. This makes me feel certain ways. Like, how do we promote a kind of environment where those things can be talked about, freely without there being any like blaming or hating, but then also a way to try and say, how do we, not do those things, or how can people just express how they feel about it? How do you think we, on this issue, create that space for Black women?
Yeah, I think as you're doing right now, validating the truth of this experience is an important starting point. When this comes up in the therapeutic setting, I also invite people to think about how they see themselves and how some of these messages have contributed to less positive views of the self and how that can be recalibrated. That also can come with minimizing the spaces in which their beauty as is celebrated, as there's a heightened attention to where perhaps they're less celebrated or less honored. So giving kind of equal space to that. I do less work, admittedly, on shifting the view of the other, but how that experience is received by the Black woman themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the part that is in their control to some extent, how they receive it. And, another thought is coming to my mind. This conversation has come up recently with a Black woman scientist. Oh. And so she is a data person. And so, she's very clear, like, this is a real thing. I read these articles, like, this is the percentage of the time that this is happening. I guess there was something that came out on one of the dating apps that ranked the desirability of different, like, racial and ethnic group. Yeah, with Black women being at the bottom. So when, there's data to underscore what we're talking about, but I really try and help people to be in spaces where they are valued, where their beauty is seen and celebrated, and for them to eagerly receive that, because that's what's in their control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the larger societal piece, as harmful as it is a little bit outside of the scope of what we can do with a therapy setting.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And that's usually my point of emphasis as well, is, what's in your kind of locus of control here? And that's you. But how you're having insight, but then also a kind of holistic way of accepting and expressing your entire experience of things is important to do. And then obviously being mindful of, the context and some of the things we talked about earlier. So last question, there's many things I could keep talking to you about, but I want to respect your time, so we can finish with this one. Of course, I would love to talk about, single parents, Black women as single parents, and just parenting in general. Intimate partner violence is a terrible thing, obviously, and the numbers are even worse for Black women, which is a sobering statistic, which you mentioned in the book. But the thing that I want to, I guess, end with is, we've kind of alluded to it of sorts, is mental health is a real thing. And there is specifically a stigma around, I think, within the Black community, as far as I understand, and then for Black women, of getting treatment, going to therapy. When I've had clients that are Black women, they will tell me, not at first usually, but at some point, like, look, this took a long time for me just to get here. And so maybe just say, like, what are some of the internal, external barriers for Black women seeking mental health treatment, and how can we, how can they specifically, but I guess in society as a whole, as we progress forward, how can we try and change that narrative? I mean, you listed some popular examples, which are great, but I guess more at the individual level, how do we, change that conversation of sorts?
Yeah, I thank you for that question. That's really at the heart of my research, and something that I am really passionate about. And I think that, part of it is, as we started the conversation, rooted in this idea of strength and what it means to be strong. And for many Black women, the idea of getting mental health treatment means I'm acknowledging that I'm weak, that I can't handle a problem on my own, that something is wrong with me. And conceptually, there's tension in that narrative, right? As a part of my work, I really I think about barriers to mental health treatment in two buckets: psychological and concrete barriers, with the psychological piece being things like identifying a need for treatment. So, there's a common belief that I'm fine. I don't need treatment. I'm not having a nervous breakdown. Like I'm doing what I need to do for the most part. It's painful. I don't feel good. I'm depressed. I'm anxious, but I'm still taking care of my kids. I'm going to work. So identifying a need for treatment. There's the belief that one can handle a problem on their own, a belief that it'll get better on its own. Some of the negative beliefs are that mental health treatment won't be helpful. That particularly when we're talking about medication treatments, the side effects to those treatments. So those are all kind of the thoughts or the beliefs that get in the way of people getting treatment. And then, of course, I know this is not exactly what you were asking, but I do think it's important to mention the concrete barriers that make it difficult for people to access treatment, like the availability of providers, childcare, transportation, insurance coverage, the cultural competence of providers, the diversity of providers, with many Black women and Black people preferring a race-matched provider. And so putting all these things together, these are multiple barriers that one has to overcome before they even kind of cognitively decide,
Absolutely.
Yes, I need help.
Yeah.
I'll entertain the idea that treatment will be helpful. And then one lands in your door. You likely know the statistic that the mean number of sessions of treatment is one. That's what it was like 15 years ago. I guess it's probably still the same.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it recently, but I know that there's that statistic, and I think the common one that I don't know how if it's still current, but it was many times it's definitely the competency so of the clinician, so which would include cultural competency. So it's I can't remember the data now, but it's somewhere where it's you don't have to match by race or age or gender. It's more of, do you know what the hell you're doing? Can you understand me, and do I see you as competent, which I would put culturally competent in there as well, as opposed to, you're Black and I'm Black, so we're going to fit well, or you're Latin and I'm Latin, so we're going to fit well. That actually doesn't square up as far as I know. It's more of the competency, which is most important, which is what you're saying. It's how do you find folks that all the barriers that you discussed are super implicated, but then also it's like, okay, well, I've overcome all of that, and then I'm here and I'm meeting with this person, and like I don't feel like they have a clue what's going on, or I don't know if this works very well. And and for many people, I mean, this is, I always tell people therapy is like, trying on a pair of shoes. It's like, you might know what your size is roundabout, but because you put on the first pair and it doesn't fit in it could be the make of the shoe. It could be how it is. And that doesn't mean you don't wear shoes. You just got to find the right fit. And, and I think therapy is somewhat like that as well. When you're trying to find a clinician, it's, well, okay, maybe there's a few things, but it's not quite the right fit. Well, you got to go 2 or 3 times. I think the problem is all those other barriers get in the way.
That's right.
It's like you got to do all that over again. So it's just very, it's very frustrating. It's not streamlined as well as it should be, but that's definitely another conversation.
Yeah, just to kind of enclose, I think it's worth just restating that deciding to get treatment is not a sign of weakness, that one does not have to wait until they're at their breaking point to make that decision to get additional support. That's a message that I really try to underscore, that, earlier intervention is better. And particularly for people who strength is such an important part of their identity, to allow them to maintain their autonomy in the process, that you're still the expert on you, that you have choice in how you move through this therapeutic process, and that you're an active participant. This isn't somebody kind of taking control over you, that it's really, an interactive engagement. And that, I think one of the other things we didn't get to is around matching in the context of like other healthcare providers where there can be a mismatch. And I think it's the same for therapy that, you know, if something isn't working, if it's not right, that is valid. That can be a valid experience that, you know, may require another provider or what have you. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, you know, last thing I'll say here is I've recommended your book. I think it's great. I hope everybody buys it. You know, and I think that, again, I said it a few times, but it's, yes, here are the problems, but how is, you know, for Black women, how can you have a sense of true empowerment and capture that and work hard to do that. And, you know, having that balance of kind of both of those messages is, you know, I think super important. It's not something I hear often in a real way. And so, you know, I just really believe in the work you're doing and in the book. And so, you know, yeah, Inger, this has been great. It's lovely to talk with you. I really do appreciate it. And just tell people where they can find you and where they can get the book and relevant places and all that stuff.
Yes, so you can find me on Twitter at IBZPsychPhD. You can find me on Instagram at Dr. Inger BZ. My home is at Northwestern in Chicago. And the book is available at all major book retailers and most independent bookstores.
That's great. I don't know what to say. It was really a blast. Too short. I really love talking with you. You're very wonderful, and I'm going to support all the work you're doing. It's great.
Thank you. It was. I really enjoyed this conversation. I really appreciate you having me.
Of course. Thank you.